The 17th of August, 1943. Wewak, New Guinea. 0247 hours. The air tasted of salt and diesel. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto stood on the tarmac of Wewak's Dagwa airfield, his leather flight jacket damp against his skin. Above him, the equatorial sky sprawled black and infinite, punctured only by stars that seemed to mock the darkness with their indifference. He could hear the Pacific breathing in the distance, waves collapsing against the northern shore, a rhythm older than empires. Around him, mechanics worked in near silence, their oil-stained hands moving over the cowlings of Nakajima Ki-43 fighters with the practiced reverence of priests attending sacred relics. The smell of aviation fuel hung heavy, mingling with the sweetness of rotting jungle vegetation that pressed in from all sides. Yamamoto's orders were clear. Patrol the northern approaches, maintain altitude at 7,000 meters, watch for anything moving through the night. For weeks, the Americans had been probing Japanese defenses along the New Guinea coast. But they came predictably daylight raids, formations announced by the thunder of hundreds of radial engines, silver specks against blue that could be counted, tracked, engaged. Tonight felt different. The radio had crackled with fragmentary reports from forward observers, engine noise without visual contact, distant rumbles that faded before interception. Yamamoto checked his watch. In 30 minutes, he would climb into the darkness and search for ghosts. War changes the sky. Before 1939, the night belonged to no one. It was a sanctuary from violence, a natural armistice enforced by darkness and human limitation. But by the summer of 1943, the night had become contested territory, a new battlefield where technology and courage collided in ways that daylight combat had never demanded. The Japanese Empire, stretched across 8,000 miles of ocean and jungle, had built its defensive perimeter on assumptions forged in the early victories of 1941 and 1942. Their fighter doctrine emphasized daylight superiority, the samurai philosophy of visible combat where skill and spirit could be demonstrated. Night operations were auxiliary, secondary patrols conducted more for psychological reassurance than tactical necessity. The idea that an enemy would commit heavy bombers to sustained nocturnal operations over hostile territory seemed not just unlikely, but wasteful. Bombers were precious instruments of strategic power, and flying them blind through darkness toward targets invisible in shadow violated every principle of efficient warfare. Yet 5,000 miles to the east, in the industrial heartland of America, a different calculus was being written. The United States Army Air Forces had studied the war's opening years with cold analytical precision, watching how the Luftwaffe had burned London by night, how darkness scattered defenses and multiplied terror. But the Americans were building something unprecedented, not sporadic night raids, but systematic round-the-clock bombardment, a campaign that would give the enemy no rest, no sanctuary, no moment to breathe. To accomplish this, they needed machines that could see through darkness, navigate through storms, find targets in absolute blackness. They needed bomber crews willing to fly where death was invisible, and they needed to do it not once, but every night, until the enemy's will fractured under the weight of relentless pressure. Lieutenant Yamamoto had trained at Hamamatsu Airfield in 1941, when victory seemed inevitable, and the Emperor's forces were rewriting the map of Asia. He had learned to fly the Ki-43 with its light controls and magnificent climb rate, mastering the vertical scissors and deflection shooting that made Japanese pilots feared throughout the theater. His instructors had been veterans of China, men who spoke of air combat as a test of warrior spirit, where superior determination overcame material disadvantage. They practiced interception techniques against high-altitude bombers, running calculations on closure rates, and firing solutions for targets that flew straight and level in defensive boxes. The bombers in these exercises were visible, you could count them, anticipate their paths, coordinate attacks with wingmen through visual signals. Night fighting had been mentioned only briefly, treated as an aberration that weather officers and luck would mostly prevent. Now, climbing through the humid darkness toward his patrol altitude, Yamamoto felt the first whispers of something his training had never addressed. The Americans were changing the rules. 3 weeks earlier, a patrol near Rabaul had reported B-24 Liberators operating after midnight, dropping strings of incendiaries that turned supply depots into beacons visible for 40 miles. The bombers had appeared and vanished without effective engagement. 2 nights ago, reports came from Madang of heavy aircraft transiting at altitude during a tropical storm, impossible conditions that should have grounded all operations. Yet the attacks continued. Yamamoto leveled at 7,000 meters and began his patrol pattern, scanning the darkness with eyes adapted to the faint starlight. He expected to see nothing. He expected to fly a careful grid for 3 hours, then land at dawn with a negative report. What he did not expect was what came next. The sound reached him before anything visual, a deep, multi-layered drone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Not the synchronized roar of formation flying, but a scattered, irregular pulse of engines operating independently. Yamamoto's heart rate increased. He scanned the darkness, looking for navigation lights, exhaust flames, anything that would give position and altitude. Nothing. The sound grew louder, definitely coming from the northwest, definitely multiple aircraft, but the darkness revealed nothing. He throttled back slightly, trying to use the relative silence to triangulate the noise. That was when he saw it, or rather, saw the absence of stars. For just a moment, a section of the sky went black, a moving hole in the stellar fabric that lasted perhaps 3 seconds before the stars returned. Then another blank space appeared, higher and to the left. Then another. They were there, massive bombers passing through the night, but flying without formation lights, scattered across the sky in loose patterns that defied interception. Yamamoto pushed his throttle forward and climbed toward where he thought one had passed, but by the time he reached that altitude, there was only empty air and the fading rumble of radial engines. He circled, frustrated, listening to the sound disperse across the sky. The bombers were not together. They were not following predictable paths. They were threading through the darkness individually, and by the time you heard them, they were already gone. He toggled his radio, reporting contact without visual confirmation, a humiliating admission that felt like failure. Below, air raid sirens began to wail at Wewak as the first bombs fell, not in concentrated salvos, but in random sequences that suggested multiple aircraft attacking different targets from different directions. Yamamoto dove toward the flashes, hoping to catch a bomber silhouetted against its own explosions, but the darkness swallowed everything. By the time he reached the bomb zone, the raiders had vanished back into the clouds and night. The confusion that paralyzed Japanese defenses that night was not the product of cowardice or incompetence. It was the collision between expectation and reality, between a doctrine built on visible warfare and an enemy that had embraced opacity. For 2 years, Japanese air defense had operated on a simple principle. Early warning networks would detect incoming raids, fighters would scramble and climb to interception altitude, and the engagement would occur in daylight, or at least in conditions where visual contact was possible. This system had worked reasonably well against the sporadic Allied attacks of 1942 and early 1943. The Americans came in large formations for mutual protection, which made them easier to spot and track. They flew during windows of good weather to ensure bombing accuracy, which meant defenders knew when to expect them. They operated from known bases at predictable ranges, which allowed Japanese intelligence to forecast attack timing. But in the summer of 1943, something fundamental changed. The Americans began sending bombers individually through the night, separated by minutes and miles, each navigator finding his own route to the target, using instruments and dead reckoning that Japanese observers could barely comprehend. These were not terror raids aimed at random destruction. They were precision attacks against specific installations, conducted in total darkness with an accuracy that seemed impossible. The bombs that fell on Wewak that night destroyed a fuel depot and damaged 2 parked bombers with surgical precision, despite being dropped through overcast at 0300 hours with no visual reference. The psychological impact exceeded the material damage. Japanese soldiers who had endured daylight raids at least understood the threat. You could see the bombers, track them, take cover when they approached your position. But these night attacks created a pervasive anxiety with no release. The enemy could be overhead at any moment, invisible and unstoppable. Sleep became tactical vulnerability. Darkness, which should have been protection, became a medium of American power. The technology that enabled America's night bombing campaign was less about revolutionary invention than systematic integration. The bombers themselves, B-24 Liberators and B-25 Mitchells, primarily in the Pacific, were machines built to American specifications of abundance. They carried more fuel than seemed necessary, more instruments than seemed rational, more crew than seemed efficient. A B-24 on a night mission over New Guinea might carry 2,000 gallons of fuel to strike a target only 400 miles away, a range-to-fuel ratio that Japanese planners considered wasteful. But that excess fuel bought options: the ability to divert around weather, to circle if the target was obscured, to return home on one less engine than aerodynamics suggested was survivable. The instrument panels in these bombers glowed with more than 24 gauges and indicators, creating enough light in the cockpit that pilots wore tinted goggles to preserve night vision. There were artificial horizons that showed aircraft attitude when no natural horizon was visible, radio direction finders that could home on signals from stations hundreds of miles away, altimeters sensitive enough to register 100-foot changes in elevation. Most critically, there were the new SCR-729 radar sets being fitted to select aircraft systems that could paint a picture of the terrain below through clouds and darkness, turning night into a green phosphorescent map where rivers and coastlines appeared as glowing signatures. These technologies were not secrets. The Japanese knew they existed in principle. But knowing about a technology and integrating it into doctrine are different challenges. American crews trained for hundreds of hours on instrument flying alone, learning to trust gauges over instinct, to navigate by radio beam and starshot when all visual reference disappeared. They practiced single aircraft missions, breaking the formation mindset that dominated daylight bombing. Each bomber became an independent war machine, capable of finding targets, defending itself, and returning home without ever seeing another friendly aircraft. This was radical decentralization in an era when centralized control was the norm. By dawn on August 17, Lieutenant Yamamoto had landed at Dagua with his ammunition unfired and his confidence shaken. In the ready room, other pilots reported similar experiences: engine noise without contact, fleeting shadows that vanished before firing solutions could be calculated. One pilot claimed to have closed within 1,000 meters of a bomber only to lose it in a cloud bank, emerging on the other side to empty sky and silence. The intelligence officer recorded their reports with visible skepticism, unable to reconcile the testimonies with what he knew about bomber operations. How could heavy aircraft operate independently at night without colliding? How could they navigate to specific targets without visual landmarks? How could they bomb with any accuracy in such conditions? The questions accumulated without answers. Yamamoto sat in the corner, drinking bitter tea and watching daylight return to the jungle. He thought about his training, about all the assumptions built into his understanding of air combat. He had been taught that the advantage always went to the fighter lighter, more maneuverable, flown by specialists whose entire purpose was interception. Bombers were supposed to be vulnerable, their survival dependent on formation discipline and mutual defensive fire. But the Americans had somehow inverted this relationship. Their bombers operated alone in conditions where fighters were helpless, using darkness as both concealment and weapon. They chose when to attack, where to attack, and could vanish before effective response could be organized. For the first time in his service, Yamamoto understood that technology might matter more than spirit, that the warrior code he had internalized was meeting an enemy who fought with different values: efficiency, redundancy, instrumental rationality. The Americans did not seek honor in combat. They sought operational success, and they were willing to use any tool, any tactic, any advantage to achieve it. The night bombing campaign over New Guinea and the broader Southwest Pacific was not improvised desperation. It was part of a systematic doctrine developed by American air planners who had studied the European War with clinical attention. By 1943, the RAF had been bombing Germany by night for 3 years, learning painful lessons about navigation, weather, defenses, and crew endurance. The Americans absorbed these lessons but applied them differently. Where British Bomber Command emphasized area bombing of cities, creating firestorms that destroyed indiscriminately, the USAAF maintained focus on precision targeting even during nocturnal operations. This required better technology and better training, both of which America's industrial base could supply. The key innovation was not any single device, but the integration of multiple systems into a coherent operational method. Navigation began with dead reckoning, calculating position based on speed, time, and heading, but was refined through celestial navigation, using sextants adapted for aircraft use. Navigators would take star sights through astrodomes, calculating position fixes accurate to within a few miles even after hours of flight. Radio direction finders allowed homing on friendly or enemy transmitters, turning electromagnetic signals into directional guides, and increasingly, radar gave direct vision through darkness and weather, allowing crews to identify terrain features, coastlines, and urban areas without ever seeing them with optical vision. The bombs themselves carried delay fuses, proximity fuses, and even early guided variations that increased effectiveness. But perhaps more important than any technology was the institutional commitment to night operations as a permanent capability rather than an emergency measure. American bomber crews rotated through specialized training courses that included dozens of hours of instrument flight, night navigation exercises, and simulated attacks on blacked-out ranges. They learned to cope with the sensory deprivation of long night flights, the fatigue that made instruments blur, the psychological stress of flying through weather with no visual reference to the world outside. They learned to trust their machines and their training when every human instinct screamed to stop trusting and take direct control. What Lieutenant Yamamoto and his fellow defenders did not know, could not know, was the extent of American material preparation. The bombers hitting New Guinea were part of an operational system that stretched back to training bases in Texas and Arizona, to modification centers in California, where civilian technicians installed radar sets and upgraded instruments, to supply chains that moved spare parts and ammunition across 7,000 miles of ocean. Behind each bomber stood a logistical tale of staggering proportion: repair depots, fuel farms, bomb dumps, parts inventories sufficient to keep aircraft flying despite the corrosive humidity and heat of tropical operations. The Americans were learning to wage industrial warfare in an environment that destroyed machinery, where fungus grew inside electrical systems, where daily rainstorms flooded revetments, where the heat warped airframes and exhausted crews. Yet the planes kept flying. When an aircraft returned from a night mission with engine damage, mechanics worked through the day to replace the entire power plant rather than attempting field repairs. When crews reported instrument failures, new units were flown forward from rear depots and installed within 24 hours. This was not efficiency born of abundant resources alone, though resources mattered. It was a systemic philosophy that treated maintenance and logistics as co-equal with combat operations. Japanese maintenance doctrine emphasized careful preservation of limited equipment, skilled technicians coaxing extra hours from worn components, accepting lower operational readiness to extend equipment life. American doctrine was almost opposite. Fly the machines hard, replace what breaks, maintain high operational tempo, even at the cost of higher consumption. The assumption underlying this approach was that production would always exceed attrition, that factories in Detroit and Seattle would supply aircraft faster than the enemy could destroy them. This assumption proved correct. By mid-1943, American aircraft production was exceeding Japanese production by a factor of 7-1. Every night bomber lost over New Guinea could be replaced within weeks. Every Japanese fighter lost defending against these raids was irreplaceable. The recurring symbol in this emerging campaign, the thread connecting night after night of operations, was not a weapon or an aircraft, but the simple green glow of radium-painted instruments. In the cockpits of B-24 seconds droning through equatorial darkness, the instrument panel created a small universe of pale luminescence. Altitude, airspeed, heading, engine temperatures, all rendered in glowing numerals that never dimmed, never needed electrical power, required nothing but the slow radioactive decay of radium isotopes to maintain their spectral light. Pilots learned to read these instruments with peripheral vision, preserving their night-adapted sight for occasional glances outside. The glow became home, the only stable reference in a world where darkness and weather erased all other landmarks. For the radar operators hunched over their scopes in the bomber's nose, there was a similar glow, the green phosphor sweep that painted terrain and targets in shades of luminescence. These glows represented more than visibility. They symbolized America's technological approach to warfare, the systematic substitution of instrumental awareness for human senses, the willingness to trust gauges and screens over direct perception, the confidence that machines properly designed and maintained would outperform unaided human capability. This was philosophically alien to Japanese combat doctrine, which emphasized pilot skill, instinctive judgment, and the ineffable warrior spirit that supposedly transcended material factors. Americans trusted their instruments because American culture trusted instruments, the same society that had produced systematic manufacturing, standardized parts, and assembly line production naturally extended this mindset into combat operations. The green glow became shorthand for this difference. Japanese night fighters, the few that existed, relied primarily on visual sighting, human eyes, and instinct. American night bombers relied on instruments and radar, technological extension of human senses. One approach was limited by biology. The other was limited only by the current state of technology, which meant it could improve with every passing month. As the weeks passed and the night raids intensified, Japanese intelligence officers in Rabaul and Tokyo began receiving reports that painted a disturbing pattern. The American bombers were not simply hitting random targets under cover of darkness. They were conducting systematic campaigns against specific infrastructure, fuel depots, repair facilities, ammunition dumps, aviation installations. The targeting showed detailed intelligence knowledge of what was where, which facilities mattered most, which targets were most vulnerable. This precision suggested either extensive reconnaissance or comprehensive signals intelligence, probably both. What Japanese analysts did not fully grasp was the scale of American information gathering. Long-range reconnaissance flights photographed Japanese positions during daylight. These images then analyzed by specialists who built detailed target folders for bomber crews. Coast watchers, Australian and native observers hidden in the jungle, radioed reports on Japanese movements and installations. Signals intelligence stations intercepted and decoded Japanese communications, building electronic pictures of force dispositions. All this information flowed into operational planning, where it was transformed into target lists, navigation waypoints, and attack profiles. The result was that American bombers often knew more about Japanese facilities than the Japanese defenders did. A night raid on Wewak in September 1943 destroyed a camouflaged fuel dump that Japanese commanders believed was secret, unknown to them. It had been photographed from 25,000 feet 2 weeks earlier, its location noted despite careful concealment efforts. The precision of the resulting attack suggested either betrayal or impossibly good luck, when in fact it was neither. It was systematic intelligence integration, the kind that industrial powers with extensive bureaucracies and communication networks could sustain indefinitely. Lieutenant Yamamoto flew 14 more night patrols between August and November 1943. He never successfully intercepted a night bomber. Several times he achieved radar vectors toward targets. Japanese ground stations had begun deploying their own early warning radars, but the vectors were always approximate, and by the time he reached the indicated position, the enemy had moved on. Once, during a full moon, he caught a glimpse of a B-24 silhouetted against clouds, its shape unmistakable for perhaps 5 seconds before it disappeared into a dark bank and was gone. He fired a short burst toward where he thought it would emerge, but his tracer rounds vanished into empty air. That near miss felt more frustrating than complete failure. To come so close and still achieve nothing reinforced the futility of the entire enterprise. Other pilots had similar experiences. A few claimed kills, bombers supposedly seen smoking or diving, but none of these claims could be confirmed. The Americans kept coming, night after night. their operational tempo never slackening. Japanese intelligence estimated they were losing perhaps 2% of their attacking force to all causes: fighters, anti-aircraft fire, weather, mechanical failure. This was sustainable indefinitely. The defenders, by contrast, were losing pilots to exhaustion and accidents. Flying night patrols in tropical weather with limited instruments was inherently dangerous. 2 pilots from Yamamoto's squadron died in crashes, attributed to spatial disorientation, losing track of altitude and attitude in darkness, and flying controlled aircraft into the ocean. Their deaths were not heroic combat losses, but mundane tragedies of night operations without adequate equipment. Yet the patrols continued because to stop them would be to surrender the night completely, to concede that the Americans owned darkness and could operate without opposition. National pride and military logic both demanded continued resistance, however ineffective. The transformation in Japanese defensive thinking came slowly, grudgingly, through accumulated failure. By early 1944, the Supreme War Council in Tokyo was receiving reports that could not be dismissed as local incompetence or bad luck. American night bombing was achieving strategic effects. Fuel reserves were dwindling as storage facilities burned. Aircraft were being destroyed on the ground because darkness prevented warning and dispersal. Supply networks were disrupted by attacks on port facilities, conducted with precision that daylight raids rarely matched. The psychological toll was equally significant. Frontline troops throughout the Pacific Theater reported degraded morale and combat effectiveness due to sleep deprivation caused by nightly raids. When soldiers cannot rest securely even in rear areas, operational capability degrades rapidly. Japanese planners proposed various countermeasures: building more night fighters, deploying better radar, creating searchlight networks to illuminate bombers for interception. But all these solutions required resources: aircraft, electronics, generators, trained operators that the shrinking Japanese economy struggled to provide. America's industrial advantage, already dominant in 1941, had widened into an unbridgeable chasm by 1944, where the United States could produce specialized night fighters, complex radar sets, and extensive training programs without sacrificing other capabilities. Japan faced zero-sum choices. Resources devoted to night defense came directly at the expense of day fighters, fleet operations, or infantry equipment. The rational choice would have been to concede the night, concentrate defenses in areas where numerical superiority could still be achieved. But rationality has limited voice in wartime decisions shaped by pride and desperation. So the futile patrols continued, and the night bombers kept coming. The crews flying these missions understood they held enormous advantages, but never allowed themselves to feel invulnerable. Night flying remained inherently dangerous, and every mission carried the possibility of catastrophic failure. Navigation errors could send bombers hundreds of miles off course into regions where fuel exhaustion meant death. Weather systems in the southwest Pacific were notoriously violent, with thunderstorms reaching 60,000 feet and turbulence that could tear aircraft apart. Engine failures during darkness, over hostile territory, with no emergency landing fields, meant crews faced decisions with no good options: bail out over jungle, attempt water landings in darkness, or try to limp home on remaining engines while losing altitude. The bombers carried extensive survival equipment, life rafts, emergency rations, first aid supplies, even small inflatable boats, but everyone knew the statistics on survival if you went down over New Guinea. The jungle killed as efficiently as enemy fire through disease, starvation, and hostile encounters with Japanese patrols. So the crews flew carefully, maintained their aircraft obsessively, followed procedures with religious devotion. Yet, they also flew with a confidence born from systemic support. Each bomber carried multiple backup systems. If one generator failed, others picked up the load. If one fuel tank was damaged, others could be cross-fed. If one navigation method proved unreliable, 3 others were available. This redundancy was expensive and added weight, but it dramatically improved survival rates. American aircraft could sustain battle damage that would destroy Japanese equivalents and still bring their crews home. Pilots told stories of returning to base with one engine dead, hydraulics shot out, and holes in the fuselage large enough to crawl through, yet the aircraft flew, and the crew survived. These stories became part of the cultural narrative around American air power. The idea that American machines were tough, reliable, forgiving of errors, protective of crews, whether objectively accurate or not, this belief increased crew confidence, which improved performance, which validated the belief in a self-reinforcing cycle. By the spring of 1944, the strategic situation in the Pacific had shifted decisively. American forces were advancing through the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, establishing air bases that brought the Philippines and the Central Pacific within range of long-range bombers. Japanese defensive perimeters were contracting under pressure that came from every direction, including from above during hours when defense was impossible. The night bombing campaign had achieved multiple effects: material destruction of critical infrastructure, psychological erosion of defensive morale, and perhaps most importantly, the establishment of air superiority that extended through all 24 hours, where early in the war Japanese planners could move supplies, reposition forces, and conduct operations during darkness without interference. By 1944, there was no safe time. American aircraft operated continuously, daylight strikes by fighters and medium bombers, nocturnal attacks by heavy bombers, all blending into a seamless campaign that gave no respite. This round-the-clock pressure accelerated the collapse of Japanese logistics networks, already strained by submarine warfare against supply shipping. Fuel became critically scarce, not just because of interdiction at sea, but because storage facilities ashore were systematically destroyed in night raids. Ammunition stockpiles dwindled as dumps were hit with precision strikes. Aircraft assembled at forward bases were destroyed on the ground by bombers that arrived without warning in darkness. The cumulative effect was to make forward defense unsustainable. Japanese forces began withdrawing from advanced positions, consolidating around core territories, conceding space in hopes of achieving more defensible perimeters. But perimeters that could not be defended at night were not truly defensible at all. Lieutenant Yamamoto was reassigned in April 1944 to Homeland Defense, his experience with night operations considered valuable as American B-29. Superfortresses began appearing over Japan itself. The new assignment felt like promotion and exile, simultaneously returning home, but also witnessing the war coming home with him. He arrived at Yokohama to find a nation transformed by 3 years of total war. The confident certainty of 1941 had evaporated, replaced by grim determination and quiet fear. Civilians spoke carefully about the war's progress, using euphemisms that admitted nothing directly but conveyed awareness that victory remained distant. Yamamoto's stories of night bombers operating with impunity were received with polite disbelief. Surely such things were exaggerations, the product of confusion or insufficient warrior spirit, but the disbelief proved temporary. Within months, American bombers were transiting Japanese skies by night, their passage marked by air raid sirens and distant explosions. The same impotence Yamamoto had experienced over New Guinea now manifested over his homeland. Fighters scrambled into darkness, hunting enemy aircraft that remained invisible, untouchable, spectral. The pattern repeated with numbing familiarity: engine noise without contact, scattered bombs falling from invisible aircraft, sirens and fires and futile patrols. He flew these missions with decreasing hope, going through procedures that he knew were tactical theater, performance without substance. Once, during a patrol over Osaka in August 1944, he climbed to 8,000 meters and simply stopped trying to intercept. He circled slowly, watching the city burn below while listening to the drone of American bombers above. They were up there somewhere, wrapped in darkness and clouds, dropping their loads with instrumental precision, then turning for home bases he could not reach. He understood in that moment that the war was lost not because Japan lacked courage, but because the enemy had transformed warfare into something unrecognizable. They had made night their domain, clouds their concealment, technology their substitute for valor. And against such an enemy, traditional virtues meant nothing. The epilogue to the night bombing campaign came not in a single moment but across thousands of nights, scattered across the Pacific theater and eventually Japan itself. By the war's end in August 1945, American bombers had flown tens of thousands of night missions, establishing air supremacy that operated continuously, without regard to time or weather. The innovation was not simply that they flew at night, many air forces had done that, but that they systematized night operations into standard procedure, transforming occasional raids into sustained campaigns. This was possible only because of interrelated factors: technological sophistication, industrial capacity, logistical depth, and institutional commitment to training and doctrine development. No single factor would have sufficed. Technology without logistics would have created capable aircraft that couldn't be maintained. Logistics without training would have moved supplies without producing competent crews. Training without doctrine would have created skilled pilots without operational purpose. The integration of all these elements produced a capability that transcended individual components, systematic night bombing as permanent fixture of American air power. For the Japanese defenders, this represented more than tactical defeat. It challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of warfare, the relationship between spirit and material, the role of technology in determining outcomes. Pre-war Japanese military philosophy had emphasized moral factors, discipline, courage, sacrifice, unit cohesion, as decisive in combat. Technology was acknowledged but secondary, a tool that superior spirit could overcome. The night bombing campaign inverted this hierarchy. No amount of courage could make darkness visible. No degree of sacrifice could track aircraft that flew beyond sensory range. No intensity of fighting spirit could overcome the exhaustion of nightly raids that permitted no sleep. Spirit mattered, but material factors mattered more. The recurring green glow of instruments, that small technological symbol, came to represent something larger in the memory of those who experienced the campaign. For American crews, the glow was reassurance, the promise that their machines would guide them through darkness and bring them home. It represented trust in systems, confidence in training, faith that careful preparation and technological sophistication could overcome natural limitations. For Japanese defenders like Lieutenant Yamamoto, that same glow, glimpsed only in the abstract, known only through its effects, became symbol of an enemy who fought with alien values. Where Japanese doctrine demanded visible engagement and honorable combat, the Americans embraced opacity and distance. Where Japanese training emphasized pilot skill and personal judgment, Americans relied on instruments and procedures. These were not merely tactical differences but philosophical ones, reflections of deeper cultural divergence about the relationship between humans and machines, between tradition and innovation, between honor and effectiveness. The war's outcome validated one philosophy over the other, at least in the context of industrial warfare between modern states. Whether this validation extended beyond that specific context remained an open question, one that post-war Japan would spend decades exploring. But for the men who flew and fought during those years, the lesson was immediate and undeniable. Darkness had been conquered, not by superhuman vision, but by patient application of technology, logistics, and systematic thought. The Americans had not defeated Japanese fighters by being better pilots, though many were excellent, but by creating conditions where piloting skill became irrelevant. They had vanished into clouds not through magic, but through instruments that made clouds transparent. They had owned the night not because night favored them naturally, but because they had invested resources and imagination into making night a medium they could navigate and exploit. The war ended with Japan's surrender in August 1945, but the lessons of the night bombing campaign echoed forward into subsequent conflicts and military development. The systematic use of darkness as tactical advantage, the integration of radar and instruments into standard operations, the emphasis on technological overmatch as force multiplier, all these became permanent features of American military doctrine. The massive investment in electronic systems, navigation aids, and crew training established patterns that continued through the Cold War and beyond. Night operations evolved from specialized capability to routine expectation, to the point where contemporary military forces operate as effectively in darkness as in daylight, perhaps more effectively given modern thermal imaging and night vision technologies. The green glow of radium instruments was eventually replaced by LED displays and heads-up projections, but the underlying philosophy remained constant. Extend human capability through technology, trust instruments over instinct, accept complexity as the price of capability. For Lieutenant Yamamoto, who survived the war and witnessed Japan's post-war transformation, the memory of those futile patrols remained vivid across decades. He rarely spoke of them, finding the experience difficult to translate into words that captured its essence. How to explain the frustration of knowing the enemy was overhead but being unable to engage? How to convey the helplessness of watching targets burn while bombers escaped into darkness? In the 1960 seconds, when Japan had rebuilt and American strategic bombers were nuclear-armed, the irony became apparent. The same technological sophistication that had defeated Japan was now defending it under the security umbrella of the U.S.-Japan alliance. The green glow of instruments in American bombers now served Japanese interests, at least nominally. History's circuits completed themselves in unexpected ways. The truth that emerged from those thousands of nights over the Pacific was not simple or comfortable. It was not that technology always defeats courage. Because courage remained essential, flying night missions required immense bravery. It was not that America won through material advantages alone, though those advantages were undeniable. The deeper truth was about how warfare had transformed during the industrial age, becoming less about individual heroism and more about systematic capability. The decisive factor was not the bravery of individual airmen on either side, but the organizational sophistication that put American bombers over Japanese targets night after night, regardless of weather, darkness, or opposition. That sophistication was built on industrial capacity, yes, but also on cultural values that emphasized systematic problem-solving, institutional learning, and willingness to trust technological solutions. American night bombers vanished into clouds because American society had created the conditions, industrial, technological, educational, that made such vanishing possible and sustainable. The Japanese defenders were not less courageous or less skilled. They were less supported, less equipped, less backed by the vast systemic advantages that industrial democracy could deploy. The green glow of instruments became, in the end, symbol not just of night bombing, but of a way of waging war that privileged system over individual, instrument over instinct, abundance over austerity. It was a way of war that fit the American character and American resources, and in the specific context of the Pacific War, it proved devastatingly effective. Whether this effectiveness represented moral progress or merely technical sophistication remained ambiguous, a question each observer had to answer according to conscience. But that it was effective, that it helped determine the war's outcome, that it changed aerial warfare permanently, these facts were beyond dispute. The bombers vanished into clouds, and in vanishing, they wrote a new chapter in the long history of how humans extend their reach through tools, how darkness becomes transparent to those who possess the right instruments, how wars are won not just by fighting but by creating conditions where fighting becomes unnecessary because the outcome is inevitable. That inevitability, demonstrated nightly across the Pacific, was perhaps America's most potent weapon, not the bombs themselves, but the systematic certainty with which they arrived, night after night, through darkness that should have been protection, but became instead merely another medium for American power to penetrate and dominate.